Um, as I said, this is a webinar on psychological imperatives of National Education Policy 2020, organized by the National Academy of Psychology, India. We have three panelists on board: Professor R.C. Tripathi, Professor Ajit Mohanty, and Professor Vinita Kaur. I'll briefly introduce three of them before I introduce the theme very briefly. All three of them are very, very senior and known scholars, so they don't need introductions. I'll just give a brief, therefore, introduction to them. Professor Tripathi is a very known social psychologist and is the former head of psychology department, Allahabad University. In fact, he was one of the institution builder kind. He worked with Professor Devanand Sinha and other very luminary scholars and built the department. He was also the former director of Gobind Ballabh Pant Social Science Institute and is very active in academics and also edits the one of the very known Indian journal published by SAIS, the Psychology and Development Society. Professor Mohanty, again, a very well-known scholar in language and education, in the area of language and education. He was former head of the psychology department, Utkal University, and then the Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University. I had the fortune of working with him. We co-founded the National Multilingual Education Resource Consortium, where he was the founder director and has given his life to language education. Professor Vinita Kaur, in India, ECC goes by her name. She started her career from NCRT. She was former head of, again, the ECC's Department of Early Childhood Education, and then later it became primary education. She was, she worked in World Bank, and then she became a professor and dean of School of Education, Ambedkar University. I'm Miniti Panda. I don't have to introduce myself. I teach in Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Okay, I'll just briefly introduce the theme in terms of why we took up this particular theme. And okay, this policy came after 34 years of our earlier policy. We implemented liberal economy. We experienced the good and bad part of it. We also experienced a series of new discourses in social sciences around our endless, discursive collusions with otherness of different kinds. And so, the last 34 years of our experiences in social, economic, and political realms should, or at least have, placed us at a slightly advantageous position to sharpen our policy statements. So let's see what kind of policy we have developed and how we have benefited from the earlier policy documents, where a lot of wisdom has been put into pronouncing the policy statements, and also our experiences in post-liberal world, post-liberal India. We actually live in an extremely economically unequal society that converts the linguistic, social, and political diversities into disadvantages for some and advantages for others. Sen talked about capability deprivation, how the economic, social inequalities advantage some and whereas disadvantage others. Education is one institution or one tool that has the potential to equalize these unequal forces, to transform the society where we can imagine, we can dream of a cosmopolitan cosmopolitan world, and of course, a equal world. But it's also important to know that we live in a predatory culture. Look at the way languages operate. English, Professor Madhu writes about it, the powerful languages actually almost kill or suppress the minoritized or powerless languages. So we see how the economy and social inequalities operate and create a kind of predatory culture. And all of us know that predatory cultures are actually fields of invisibility, because it invisibilizes a lot of practices which create inequalities. And also inequalities become very commonplace. They become they get naturalized, creating a kind of immunity to for its victims against a full disclosure, even for themselves, of its menacing capabilities. And therefore, it's very important to reflect on the the education policy, which is meant to create a system that foregrounds, or that at least promises some kind of equal society. So, you know what, therefore we should, because we live constantly in a predatory culture, we should build an education system that is not centered around market imperatives. Rather, it develops out of the imperatives of freedom, cognitive justice, democracy, and critical citizenship. I draw on McLaurin's work to articulate this, the kind of imperatives a good and promising educational system that should build itself on. In this seminar, because all three panelists, including me, we are psychologists, and we represent a psychological organization called National Academy of Psychology. We decided to critically examine the psychological imperatives of national education policy. Of course, all of us will be interdisciplinary in our approach, but we'll still try to focus a little more on what kind of psychological fundamentals this education policy builds itself on, and what kind of fundamentals actually can meet some of the promises that I just mentioned. And are these also the goals of this national education policy? If not, what kind of revision we should even today demand for in the national education policy? I'll stop now and I'll pass on to Professor R.C. Tripathi. I have already introduced you, Professor Tripathi. Before I pass it on to you, I'll just mention the structure of this dialogue. We have prepared a set of questions, and these questions are also shared with all the speakers this morning, so that they can take care, so that they prepare themselves for these questions. And some of the questions may come impromptu, but the questions are already shared. So what I'll do, I'll ask one question. In other words, I'll read out one question that we have already formulated, and the speaker will respond to that. And then I will read the second question. And if the context requests, I might ask a new question, which I haven't already shared with you. So Professor Tripathi, you can unmute you. And what I will do once I ask the question, I'll unmute my audio. And again, when I ask the second question, I'll then mute it and then again unmute it. So Professor Tripathi will be reflecting more on the fundamental principles of national education policy, as well as the vision of national education policy. The vision is articulated in a paragraph, and basically, if you want to know the page numbers, it spans over from page number 3 to page number 6. Page number 6 gives you the vision. Page number 3 and 4 give you the fundamental principles. So he'll be critically reflecting on them. So here goes the first question. Professor Tripathi, I'm asking the first question. What is in national education policy that is of concern to psychologists?
Thank you very much, Miniti. Namaste to Ajit and Vinitha and to all the participants who have gathered here to listen to us. I must congratulate Tushar, who has been taking this initiative to organize these webinars on behalf of the National Academy of Psychology, uh, and has kept many of us involved in the webinars which have been taking place. Um, that's one advantage to have young people around. I think the old people give up too soon, the young ones don't. So thank you very much, Tushar. I assume that you can listen to me. Just confirm that you can. Is my voice audible?
It's clear, Professor Tripathi.
So I can go ahead. All right, I think the question which has been posed, and I don't know how many of you had chance to go through the national education policy. It has been in the newspaper. It has been, I think, on various channels. The question which I think we should be asking as members of the National Academy of Psychology is this, which is a very straight one. The straight question goes something like this. NEP is out. Uh, do psychologists see a role for themselves in NEP? I think it's a question which probably does not need to be answered, and the reason for that is very simple. The reason is that wherever there are humans and wherever there are human matters, we need psychologists. It's kind of sad that the framers of the national education policy did not include any of us. They included some educationists, but they did not include any psychologists. But many of the previous national educational policies either have included a psychologist. So that's all right. But that does not mean that that reduces the importance of psychology. And what I like to suggest is that I think we need to become a little vocal, because there are issues with which I think we need to engage and we need to feel concerned about. We can help the national education policy get implemented better. And there's certain questions which I think we should be posing to these people who have framed the national education policy. Let me begin by asking this question, that why do we need an educational policy in the first place? We have been having these national educational policies for a pretty long time, for almost 70 years. And have they really delivered? There have been evaluations. Actually, I was talking to Professor Sudha Rao of NEPA only the other day. They have done some evaluation of the 1984 policy and have made certain observations. I'm not aware what kind of observations have been made and what kind of evaluations have been made, and on what grounds they have been found to be useful or to have succeeded or not succeeded. This new education policy doesn't say anything about those evaluations. Only hope that they have taken some inputs and used them to their use. They've used them purposefully. They've used them creatively. As I asked, why do we need national educational policy? I think one reason why a national educational policy is required, not educational policy, is because You want education to align in some ways with the national policies. Uh, you have a vision of education which will somehow promote national development. And when I'm talking about national development, I think the idea of development uh, is very simple. Uh, the idea is that it will contribute to, let us say, whatever we measure in terms of development. For example, we measure GDP, so we should be measuring uh, and finding out, how educational, whatever educational initiatives have been taken have contributed uh, to growth in development. Sometimes, they talk about literacy and other kinds of things, but basically what you're talking about are these are statistics. What you're basically interested in is in economic indicators, not in other indicators. They have not really, there have been studies, but they don't seriously talk about whether there's any connection between, let's say, literacy level and rise in the crime statistics. They don't talk about whether with the economic development the corruption index changes. Some of these issues have not really come in. But yes, I think everybody tells us, including Amartya, that education is connected with development. Education frees. Education can be used for capability development. That is what Amar Sen says. And Amar Sen is not the first one. I think you can go back to Gandhi. When Gandhi was talking about Swaraj, he had in mind that somehow education which we provide to students should be integrated with life. Then, of course, came Prime Minister Nehru, and he talked about, and it still is there somewhere in the Constitution, that education should contribute to the development of scientific attitude. And nowadays, we're talking about that education should not only contribute to scientific attitude, but it should also sort of sensitize us to our cultural history, and it should also contribute to building of what we call cultural nationalism. NEP, in a very interesting manner, I think, has tried to combine all three strengths of these political leaders. There is a bit of a Swaraj there, of Gandhi. There is a lot of, I would say, talk about scientific attitude and scientific temper. There is a talk about, our cultural heritage and so on and so forth. But leave aside this political philosophy, the question which I thought I began with was that, is there something here for psychologists? What kind of role can they play? And I said that, well, wherever there are humans, we need psychologists. Why do I say that? I say that because when we're talking about, let's take, for example, economic development. Now, we know it from studies which have been carried out that there is a relationship between need for achievement and economic development. So we're talking about economic development. Uday Parikh straight away comes to mind. Maclellan comes to mind, of course, but I think I'm talking about an Indian psychologist. Uday Parikh comes to mind. T.V. Rao comes to mind. All of these people, who've been experimented with need for achievement and risk taking. We also know that it's not only economic development, but when it comes to other issues, for example, it comes to, let us say, social inclusion, it comes to sort of building society which is based on equality, and NEP talks about social equality, social justice, and those kinds of things. We believe that social equality and social justice Uh, you know, higher is the educational level of people, greater will be social equality, and greater will be the degree of social justice which will be rendered to people who are not very advantaged, who are actually disadvantaged people. Now, whether that has happened is another question, and I think we can discuss about that a little later. But that certainly happens to be one of the goals. I think you want to, I think one of the main objectives of the education will be that somehow you want to lift the people who are very, very disadvantaged, you know, whether they're disadvantaged socially, they're disadvantaged economically, they're disadvantaged economically, or they are, for that matter, disadvantaged physically. What I think is interesting about NEP is that it's built as a policy for the 21st century. I think it talks about that, well, there are certain needs of the 21st century which it's going to fulfill if we create the kind of human resource that is required. We're not very clear on the kind of competencies that will be required in the 21st century, because we're still in the early days of 21st century. It's still 80 years sort of. I mean, we still have to travel 80 for 80 years, but uh, the NEP talks about that we want to have a very vibrant knowledge society. Now, for that to happen, we have to create knowledge. I mean, if you're only sort of asking FDIs to come in, if you're asking, 100 universities to come in and join hands with other universities and creating the kind of knowledge which they want to create, the question which I think you have to ask is whether that kind of a knowledge which gets created will be context sensitive. That will be the kind of knowledge which our people will need, whether it will fulfill the learning needs of our people. How will it connect with communities? How will it, let's say, cater to the needs of the rural people? I think those are kind of the questions which we will have to ask. Another thing which I think probably is going to happen is that most of these 100 universities which are going to come from outside, or the universities which we have already starting to mimic, I think you can go by the kind of systems which we have now. Kind of a structure we need to have in place. One of the things which is happening, for example, is that we have the choice-based credit system. Then we borrowed something which, in a hierarchical society, I don't know how much of that has really worked, is what I think Miniti and Jeet are very familiar with. In the universities, we decided that we will have a headship by rotation and other kinds of things. We have sort of borrowed these kinds of things. Now, the question which I have been asking is whether the kind of education which we're going to get will be appropriate to our needs, to our social needs, to our cultural needs. How will that connect to, let us say, Gandhi Swaraj, or will it connect with Gandhi Swaraj at all? Will it connect, how will it connect with life in India? Does it really consider connecting life with India? Or, as I know, having some experience of studied abroad, that most of these universities will be preparing students they can hire for the industries back home. Now, if that be the goal, then I think we have to really understand that NEP probably will not serve the purpose and the needs of the country, because it will not connect with the communities. Um, Minithi, I ask you if I take more time just to stop me, otherwise I'll keep talking. Am I doing all right? Can I
Fine,
speak?
but you have 5 more minutes and we have two questions. I'll read out other two quickly, but you first
Well, I
finish this
stop
one.
here. I stop
No,
here. I'd like to
you.
answer two questions.
Okay, I'll read out both together so that you can do it, the way you want to. The second is, what role do you see psychologists can play in achieving the objectives that the policy seeks to achieve? And third question is, what values and competencies need to be developed through education, and how can they be enhanced? So you can take them together.
Well, I was talking about these different paths, and there's a lot of confusion, I think, in NEP. As I said, that when you're inviting 100 universities, which of course is, I'm not against the invitation, extending invitation to such universities, but I'm more interested in improving the quality of Indian educational institutions. That should be our goal. Our objectives need to be very clear. I think one of the problems which we have here is that we do not have a good national policy. You know, whatever is there in the constitution cannot be considered as a policy. Okay, social justice, etc. You know, whatever else is there. Those are not policies, those are values, and those values have been there since 1950. Now, I think what I'm suggesting here is uh, that psychologists need to play a role where we can sort of somehow integrate the objectives of, let's say, we're traveling on different paths. How do how can we make these students converge on something? If they keep traveling on different paths, then I don't think it's possible to really uh, deliver what we want to deliver. But obviously, when you're talking about psychology people should be talking about, you know, intervening, as obvious as it is, in the in let's say focusing on what are the problems of the learner, what are the problems of the teacher, because I think one of the major problems we are going to face is when we're talking about multidisciplinary approach and other kinds of things is we don't have teachers trained, using multidisciplinary approaches. Now, if a teacher, you know, of chemistry has not learned mathematics, or has not learned biology, or a biology person has not learned mathematics, uh, how on earth do you expect that this person would be able to do justice to whatever he or she is going to teach? So I think teachers are going to be a problem. I think so. I think when it comes to the teaching learning process, when it comes to pedagogy, when it comes to, let us say, regulations, and I think the question which we have to ask is, psychology people, particularly organizational psychologist people, need to ask, do these regulations which are going to be there actually regulate? Have they regulated? UGC has been regulating the quality of PhD. Has it really gone up? Has the quality? I think the UGC should be asking, I've been a member of the UGC. It should be asking, in the last whatever number of years they have been there, have they really, how have they contributed to the improvement of the quality? In my experience, what has happened is that the quality of teaching, quality of let's say students coming out of these portals, they it it is going down very, very steadily. Be it let's say in terms of, you know, they're poor. Students are poor in cognitive development, they're poor in social development, they're poor in emotional development. Everywhere we have a role. Now there's another one which has been added, is spiritual development. I read it as, my reading of that is, let's say, moral development. Have they been really been able to turn these students into moral agents? What have they done? But I think psychology people have never been involved in some of these things. We talk about diversity, that students are diverse. The NEP talks about that these students will be treated as unique persons. Now, if they're treated as unique persons, it means that they will have, each one of them will have their own learning style. Now, if each one of them has its own learning style, teachers will have to sort of understand each learner's learning style and then adapt his or her learning styles which will suit the learner. Now, are they ready to do that? Or teachers are really going to do what they have been doing, come out and lecture and go back? There is a significant change which needs to take place. And I think that's where psychology people would be probably needed. Okay.
Thank you, Prof.
Is there another question or I'm done?
Unmute yourself, Minati has to unmute. Yeah.
Okay. Professor Tripathi, because we will come back to you again. So let's take more questions after other two speakers complete their parts. I will now request Professor Vinita Kaul to take the questions, because the early childhood education comes first. So I thought, Professor Mohanty can come later and also can reflect on how language is dealt with in early childhood education and care. So I thought let's have Professor Vinita Kaul first. So Professor Kaul, I've sent you the questions. You can take them, some of them together also, but I will read the first question now. And if you want to go sequentially, we'll go like that. Otherwise, you can also combine the questions.
I think we can go sequentially, but if there is an overlap, of course, I will bring it.
You can. So, the first I'll read out. Being a psychologist and an ECC expert, what advantage do you see in combining the first 5 years of schooling up to age 8 and bringing it under MOE? I'm asking you because, I heard you talking about this since more than a decade, and you always lamented for not being heard enough by people, and you had enough academic logic for it. And therefore, I thought you are eminently placed to discuss this question. Please.
Thank you, Minati, and thank you also to the National Academy of Psychology for giving me this opportunity. And it's like homecoming for me, because I've been away from psychology for a very long time, being in education for all, I can't recall how many years I've spent in education. All of us have. The question that you're asking is very, very pertinent, especially for this webinar, which is being conducted by the National Academy of Psychology, because I think early childhood care and education, and this particular recommendation, flows from a psychological and a developmental understanding of the child. So, and it's very, very, therefore, pertinent to locate it within the frame of psychology, and psychology as a discipline. But of course, it is influenced by other disciplines as well. The understanding of, here we are talking basically about the child and about learning. As you rightly said, that I've been trying to pursue this for a very long time, this particular recommendation. And I keep saying, for me, it is a dream come true, really, because I've been confronted with a lot of opposition to this recommendation or this proposal, largely because I see it from a psychological perspective due to my own training. And Professor Tripathi was one of my teachers. I think we were his first batch. So I attribute a lot to the training that we got from him and Professor Durganand Sinha, which really inculcated the psychological principles within us. And so there is this whole tendency to look at everything from a psychological perspective, which I don't find among educationists, And educationists see it from a subject discipline point of view, not from the child's point of view. So as we often say that early childhood education, actually you are teaching a child, whereas in primary education and thereon you're teaching a subject, that is the distinction between the two. So child as a psychological being has to be seen in totality in terms of the child's overall development. And where does this recommendation come from? It comes from the fact that what has been happening till now, and I hope that this recommendation gets implemented appropriately. I'm assuming that it does. And if it does, what would be the benefits of it? Somewhere the recognition of the fact that learning is a continuous and cumulative process. It doesn't happen in spurts, because your preceding experiences and your understanding influences the way you perceive and you negotiate the next set of learning challenges. So it is a continuous and comprehensive process, and therefore you have to address the entire learning continuum. You cannot start from somewhere midway and start saying at the age of 6 and start saying that, why are children not learning? Because somewhere you have not taken into cognizance what has preceded those 6 years. So as a matter of fact, there was a very well-known, well-known quotation from the Jomtien conference in 1990, which said learning begins at birth. And now there is evidence that it begins even pre-birth, And therefore, somewhere this whole recognition or acknowledgement of early childhood has been missing. And the relationship between the two was not getting seen. So one of the points that I wanted to make was about this learning, the process itself. You have to follow the continuum because of the continuity and cumulative nature of learning as a cognitive process. There's also brain research, which has now come in a very significant way, which has shown and which is mentioned in the policy, that it very clearly shows that the growth of the brain or the development of the brain is very rapid in the initial years. And it is by the age of 5 or 6, or even by 7 or 8, it starts to plateau. It is too late to start then, because most of what the brain needs is required more at the early stage, that upfront. And also the recognition that the brain is very amenable to the environment. The development of the brain is very amenable to the environment. And therefore, it is not only about genetics, but it's also genes, but it is also about the kind of stimulation the child gets, the cognitive stimulation the child gets from the early years in the child's environment. And the third most critical finding, which is there from brain research, which is very relevant to this foundational learning, which I want to place it in a theoretical framework, is that within the early years, that is the preschool years, or the 3 to 6 years, or even before that, from birth to 6, many of the cognitive and language competencies that are required in primary school, for instance, and later on in life, the foundational competencies for that are laid in these early years. So the foundation is laid then. So if you are missing out on that, then you are losing that opportunity, because that is those are the critical periods when the child is most receptive to experiences which will help to develop these competencies. So given this provides the rationale for why this foundational stage. So then, and what is actually happening is, if you see in the field, in contrast, is that there is in the primaries, the curriculum for the school education, or even the school education itself, as you know, starts from class 1. And it is only in this policy now that it is being suggested that it should start from preschool. So the preschool has been kept out of the school stage. It has been kept out of the RTE also, the right to education as well. And it has just not got this due acknowledgement of the fact that this is the most critical period for all learning. So what happens with it is also that, how did this foundational learning come into the policy is also something I would like to share, because I think it is important. As you are saying that I've been talking about this for a decade, or even more than a decade perhaps, and nobody is listening to me. So I've have the perseverance to keep talking, that someday somebody will listen. And so I have been to various committees who have been formulating policies, including the Subramaniam committee earlier, and tried to make a case for it. And so for this particular one, I had the good fortune of having Professor Kasturi Rangan as the chair of the committee. And I would really give him due, acknowledge his major contribution to this recommendation, because he not only gave me a long time for a discussion, but he was very knowledgeable about it himself. And he was knowledgeable about cognitive science and brain research and so on. And he really appreciated the point that I was making, or what I was saying. An added advantage that, in addition to him being receptive, was that we had done a major longitudinal research from 2011 to 2017, of 5 years, over 5 years, where we had actually followed up, tracked a sample of a cohort of 4-year-olds, started as 4-year-olds, and then we continued to track them every year, every quarter, as a matter of fact, for 5 years, up till 2017. We brought out the report in 2017. And what we found in that was, because there is absolutely no data on early childhood education, So what we found, that this was entirely a rural sample across 3 states, including Andhra, not Telangana, Assam, and Rajasthan. What we found significantly was, one, that children who were coming into the school system, there was a lot of diversity in the sense that they were following different pathways. There was some children who were 6-year-olds would be sitting in preschool, or even 8-year-olds sitting in preschool, and there would be 4-year-olds sitting in the primary schools. So, and there would be also a lot of lateral movement among the children, so that it was not necessary that what a curriculum or what a school education is conceptualized as a children is actually not the case. And therefore, to have a very rigid, strict curriculum for class 1, class 2, class 3, like that is not a very, is not actually supported by this reality. And therefore, children are lagging behind. So a child who is coming into class 1, or even in a preschool, and then comes into class 1, the minute he leaves class 1, he is has no opportunity to come back to the textbook of class 1. And therefore, the cumulative deficit grows. And as a result, you have the major gaps in learning, which you see in the learning crisis that is being talked about. One of the findings we found in this was that one major reason for that is that children at age 5, we had developed and standardized an instrument for assessing children's cognitive readiness, cognitive and language readiness at age 5. That is a time when most children are going into school. And we found their levels were very low. They were not able to really negotiate with the instrument. And this has been now further standardized across a very large sample. So school readiness levels were low, despite the fact that a lot of them were going in for preschool education. So we cannot also say that preschool education is, they were not getting the benefit of preschool education, and therefore they were not able to have the result, because a large number were going, but still they were not able to really get that levels that were required. And one of the major reasons for that was because we made a very intensive and comprehensive assessment of quality of these preschools. Every year we used to assess what kind of a quality the children were getting. And we found that the quality was really very, very detrimental for children. Not only was it not conducive for their learning, but it was detrimental. And when I say detrimental, because we found that there was a downward extension of primary education all through the private Anganwadis as well as government schools. Everybody was more or less onto the same pattern, some with more, some with less. Private schools were, of course, the major culprits in this downward extension. And when we assessed the learning, the school readiness levels, and subsequently the learning levels of children in the primary grades, we found that those who had gone through the formal structured teaching or the 3 R's, the formal teaching of 3 R's as it is called, actually the relationship of their learning with their experience with their learning levels was actually inverse. I mean, there was an inverted correlation between the two, that they were actually not able to even attain the kind of school readiness levels. Found any good practices in terms of what is called developmentally appropriate curriculum, we found a very significant correlation. So three major factors that came in from here. One, as I said, there were different pathways that children were following, and therefore the need for flexibility. Why I'm saying this? Because this is what the recommendation is saying. So therefore the need for flexibility in the curriculum. The second was that the school readiness levels were not up to the mark, and therefore children were not able to, one of the major reasons why they were not able to perform in primary grades. So somewhere, ensuring quality and school readiness have been more cognitive readiness in terms of a play-based program. So that is something, the curriculum has to be more play and activity based. And the third point was that wherever there was a high level of school readiness in children, there was a very linear direct correlation with learning achievements in language and mathematics in the primary grades. So that kind of validated the whole concept of cognitive readiness. So these were some of the findings which we shared with the committee, and Professor Kasturi Rangan was very taken up with that, because if you see the recommendations in the policy, it talks about, one is the quality, to make it more play and activity based and developmentally appropriate. It talks about making it flexible. And the third, another finding which we had because of it being a longitudinal research, another finding that we had from the study was that wherever there was just preschool was good quality, but then subsequently they went into primary, then the impact was still there, but it was declining over time. But where the preschool was good and the primary school was also of the same nature, I mean, the transition between preschool and primary was smooth, there the learning gains were optimal and much more sustainable. So that brought in the whole the kind of the continuum, the need to address the whole continuum, and also that by age 8, children are more or less, their developmental characteristics are very similar to the children who are younger rather than those who are older. I mean, if you do a kind of a relative comparison. And therefore the need to have a similar pedagogy also, which is more activity based, much more play based into these years, so that not only is the transition smooth, but also the children are still in that phase when they are growing and they would be able to really benefit from that. So that's why the need to bring in the two together, so as to be able to lay the proper foundation for children with the intention that by age 8, they should be kind of, the understanding by age 8 is because the RTE talks about 6 years as class 1, age of admission, although most states are now bringing in children at age 5, which is again a problem. But the 6 to 8 therefore becomes the primary years, early primary years. And by age 8, it is expected that children will have at least mastered the basics through this process of a sound foundation and appropriate pedagogy.
Vinita, we don't have much time. So what I will do is, I will skip question number 3. 2, 4, and 5. These are not necessarily questions for psychologists, but they are important questions. And since you dealt hugely with this section, I want you to answer. And please answer in 1 or 2 minutes. Don't elaborate.
Sorry,
if you have time.
I didn't get that.
I'm asking you the questions, just give us brief answers, like in 1 or 2 sentences,
okay.
Instead of elaborating, so that we can move on to Professor Mohanty quickly. So given the context, as you know, the 0 to 6 age group was removed from the Right to Education Act. Okay, now we talk about foundational learning to be one of the primary goal, and this should be also pushed in mission mode. We talk about a mission also. Yeah. So I can see a lot of force behind. So I want you to want to ask you, do you see an urgent need to revise the Right to Education Act 2009 to accommodate this age group?
Absolutely. It is absolutely imperative because, as I said, even philosophically, if you see, when you're saying a child has a fundamental right to learn, so where does the learning begin? It doesn't begin at age 6.
So that's
something that contradicts the very principle of learning and development.
So that's something all of you have to actively demand for. That without getting it included in the Right to Education Act, these promises will not be made, because where do you suddenly get teachers? And the kind of program you have asked for is brilliant, but it is extremely resource demanding in terms of classrooms, in terms of teachers, in terms of training, in terms of imagining new pedagogies and materials. And so unless we put it in Right to Education Act, this will not be materialized. This will not be translated. Second, suppose we don't put in Right to Education Act, what you will see is that the private sector will enter into this sector because the government will fail. So private will come. So we will only privatize this particular segment and then subsequent segments. That fear is also there. Okay, the fourth question, third I'm not asking you. The fourth question is, do you fear that, now you have asked for reorganization of grades. So new segmentalization you have asked for, 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4. I was looking at that now when we ask for a reorganization. So NCERT might think of, and also private players will think of new textbooks, new curricular framework, all that. And when everything gets reorganized, there is a possibility that the market will enter into this much more than the government. Do you see this?
I see. I see, Minati, that yes, actually this has already begun to happen in the sense that they have to re-look at the whole curriculum framework and bring in early childhood education into it and look at the foundational learning and so on. I see there are three elements into this question. There is a segmentation of stage, as you said, which is there, which is deviating from the previous 10+2. There is a whole privatization already there, and it is already a very significant phenomenon that is there, which cannot be now stopped unless some drastic measures are taken. And you've also raised the issue of excessive pedagogical intervention or pressure.
Yeah,
because I see it, the segmentation of stage and the focus on this stage and the focus through the curriculum framework and so on, if there is an adequate communication strategy, will at least retrieve some of the lost ground, in the sense that the children will be able to get a better kind of education. Because there's going to be a lot of emphasis on the curriculum and teaching and so on. Of course, the preparation of teachers is very important. Where the market comes in a lot is because of the privatization and related to the excessive pedagogical intervention that you're talking about, because there is no regulation at all for the private sector at the moment in the country. It's a completely unregulated sector, and therefore they have any teacher, anybody comes in to teach without any training. Most of the time you find that there's no training. And as a result, they will resort or fall back upon the same practices, but use methods that are not appropriate. So then the pressures are likely to come in. As a matter of fact, the recommendation to put it in the school sector has already raised these fears that, will it make it too rigid and too top heavy? And what the effort is that instead of the downward extension, it needs to be an upward extension, so that you reform the school sector also. It's not just that you reform the preschool, but you reform the school sector also through this intervention.
So we need some regulation to put a check on, private, marketization of this sector. And that's a must, otherwise we'll fail. In fact, what happened, we started with the DPEP program, then we moved to SSA, and we tried to strengthen the school education discourse within government sector and also the vision. And the result was that we have more number of private schools, and the government schools are closing down. So my fear is, this is a brilliant part of the policy. The fact is that we have asked for reorganization of grades. We have created scope to then start everything FRIS, and that's when market enters in a big way. So there has to be a regulation against that works against, this marketization. Okay, the last question, again, you can be brief. There is a fear that setting up of educational school complexes in tribal and other rural areas may create the problem of universal access for children living in geographically challenging areas. I just want to comment because, people feel that if the schools, the small schools, where you have 10 children, 15 children in remote tribal areas, hilly areas, are closed down, and then bigger complexes are created, but the children can't cover that distance physically. So most of them drop out, and the experiences show that children are actually dropping out. So even if there is a promising big school, extremely resourceful, but the children will not, the real needy children will not access it. So that fear runs. What's your answer? So actually we are very skeptical about this school complex program because we also see it as a vehicle to close down many small schools on the ground of inviability, and then allowing, again, private market to enter in different ways.
I think, Minati, that school complexes, concept of school complexes is being misunderstood here. School complexes is not to put schools together and make a big complex, like a mega school. That is not the idea. School complexes is a recommendation that was there in even Kothari Commission report, if I'm not mistaken, in 1964, as well as in the 1986 policy. The idea is to have a cluster of schools in particular geographies which are able to support each other with the higher secondary school or the upper primary school, whichever is there. The principle of that being kind of taking the leadership role and being able to optimize resources within that geography, so that if there are, for example, a number of schools and some don't have teachers, some have teachers, some don't have a maths teacher or a language teacher, then there can be sharing of teachers, sharing of resources, which according to me, because I think teaching is a very isolating experience for teachers, especially in the remote areas, because there's nobody to kind of even back them up. So this will bring in a kind of community of schools coming together under the leadership of the senior most institution. The problem that you are saying very rightly is the phenomenon of emptying schools. And those emptying schools are not happening because of the school complexes. Emptying schools are happening because of the privatization. There is a very high level of privatization, which is leading to migration of children to private schools. And as a result, the government school system is shrinking. And there are these very small schools. There, what the government is doing, what they're calling consolidation of schools. So there, what you are rightly saying is that they are combining it with the, say, upper primary school or any other school, two primary schools put together. That is creating the problem for some children who are losing their schools in their immediate neighborhood and are too young to be able to actually travel to the larger school. And therefore, somewhere there is a need to have some kind of more improvised, or like, in the DPEP, if you remember, there were the education guarantee schemes, centers, which were like catering to 5 children, 10 children, 20 children. So something like those more innovative models will need to be thought through for such children who are left behind. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Professor Kaul. We'll come back to you again, but thank you again. So I'll move to Professor Mohanty.
Sentence, Vinati.
Yeah.
I can add one sentence.
Yes, sure.
One of the concerns, since you're raising the question of privatization and the market forces, I think in this dream come true for me, the sour point of it I would like to share is that the government is not willing to put in much resources into this. And as a result, they are depending entirely on the Anganwadi sector for delivering preschool education. And the Anganwadis are stretched beyond measure because of their multi-sectorality. And therefore, as already what is happening is children are moving out of Anganwadis into the private schools. And this is only going to get worse. So somewhere that is something that has to be really addressed.
Yeah. If government runs in a mission mode and provides all the resources, teachers, train the teachers, this will be a very promising part of NEP. provided government does it, and I think the primary thing, as you said, that this should be included now in the Right to Education Act. That's one of the primary things we should demand for. I'll move to Professor Mohanty then. Professor Mohanty, of course, you're known as a language expert, trained in psycholinguistics. So I'll ask you questions around language policy, which actually 15 deal with language policy, and it's titled Multilingualism and the Power of Language. So the first question, I've shared all the questions with Professor Mohanty, but I'll read out for others. The first question is, given the context that NEP mentions multilingualism only in the subheading and not in the text, if you read the text, from 4.11 to 4.22, 4.11 to 4.22, it talks about training teachers in bilingual instruction, 4.11, and developing high quality bilingual textbooks. It doesn't mention multilingualism afterwards. Do you agree with the statement that NEP has defeated the psychological and pedagogical imperatives of a long and rich tradition of research on multilingual brain, mind, and learning in recent times?
Well, I think you are right that the document actually keeps referring to languages, talks about mother tongue, home language, local language, Schedule 8 languages, classical languages, and so on. But the document actually displays a very superficial understanding of the nature of multilingualism in India. I'm therefore not surprised that the document does not mention at all, not just in the sections that you mentioned, nowhere else in the document multilingualism is mentioned except that subheading you referred to. It should not be, therefore I'm not really surprised that the policy actually avoids mentioning multilingualism, and then again uses at least 8 to 10 different references to language, all interchangeably, as if they do not, there are no difference between them. Talks about mother tongue, home language, local language, regional language, state language, scheduled language, Indian and major Indian languages, and so on and so forth. And mostly in obliques, like this, anything can go. Therefore, we need to realize that the understanding of multilingualism as a psychosocial position, not just psycholinguistic, but psychosocial position, is perhaps not there. That a multilingual mind is a complex composite of all the different terminology, mother tongue, local language, regional language, and so on and so forth. It's much more than that. Not just a combination of all these, but it's a more complex composite of all these and much more than that. That is something which I think has been grossly overlooked in the policy. Psychologically, we need to understand that a multilingual brain, besides offering many other neurolinguistic and psychological and psycholinguistic advantages, it's also a brain and the functioning of language which remains open to multiple languages, even when the context of use may be focused on one language. Even if you are hearing just one language, our brain actually is capable of switching on and triggering on any other languages that I know. Therefore, the flexibility in moving between languages and language without borders and binaries, as I have called it in my own writing, it's a very characteristic feature of language users in a multilingual society, including India. All children in multilingual society, and this is another feature, regardless of their own level of multilingual competence, are progressively socialized for multilingual modes of functioning. In other words, they know and understand the nuances of socially appropriate multilingual communication, even if they may not be having high levels of multilingual competence of their own. And therefore, so, as I have shown, somewhere by the age of 9, a child is able to understand the nuances of multilingualism in a multilingual society. And that is something that is necessary to realize, because this kind of early functioning and the ability to switch between languages, flexibility, understanding multilingual modes of functioning and all that. And along with that, children develop a early heightened sensitivity to languages, something that we call multilingual, metalinguistic skill, or more generally metacognitive skill in psychological literature. And that actually enables the child to move from a strong mother tongue foundation to other languages. This is something that I think we need to understand, that in a multilingual society, a child is specially equipped to move not only between languages, but move from a strong foundation of mother tongue to many other languages, including Hindi, English, or for that matter, any language. And he can move to many languages as tools for cognitive and academic engagement. That is something that we need to realize. So to talk about the superficial reference to bilingual instruction, bilingual textbooks or resource books and so on, this is actually it's a very weak kind of a position, both psychologically and pedagogically, in that context of rich bilingualism that we are talking of. Unfortunately, I think the national education policy does not show any familiarity with the robust research and practice in this country on multilingualism and multilingual education. I will not elaborate right now, maybe subsequently I will come back to this, but this is my observation, preliminary observation to your questions. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, you are mute. You are on mute. On mute.
I'll take the fourth question first, and then I'll take the second question, because fourth is related to this one. In India, we all know that it takes most of the schools, even in rural areas, many rural areas, border areas in states, tribal areas, urban, semi-urban areas, children speaking different mother tongues study. So if we fix one mother tongue for a class, it doesn't work. So bilingual mode anyway will not work in early years of schooling in most schools in India. So the fourth question is, my reading of section 4.13 and section 4.14 in the language part convinces me that three-language formula refers to sequentially arranged language planning in schools, then that promotes monolingual pedagogy. So you have two languages being used as instructional for instructional purposes, but each employs monolingual pedagogy. Do you agree with that? What are your comments?
Okay, I think let's try to understand this this thing called three-language formula. I called it a three-language fossilized structure. I will give you the reasons for it. In 1956, it was first mooted to bring about, I think, conference of education ministers and all that, to bring about some uniformity in terms of languages and school education. The three-language formula notified by the Ministry of Education at that time from time to time. It continued to be revised till about 1967. And thereafter, people sort of vaguely talk about three-language formula. I think what now remains of the three-language formula, as I said, is a fossilized structure. The three language formula actually talked about mother tongue, regional language, Hindi and English at that point in time, 60s and so on. And most unfortunately, and that's the most unfortunate part, which is repeated in the current policy also, it clubbed mother tongue and regional language together, public, mother tongue or regional language, recommending mother tongue or regional language as medium of instruction in early years. In practice, the state actually, all the states, not just one state, the states imposed regional language on every child, regardless of our actual mother tongue. Somebody, I think I was looking at the question, somebody asked about the backward classes. The minority tribal language speakers also constitute part of the backward class, and their mother tongue was completely ignored. So the three language formula actually failed to bring about any uniformity in principles and in structure of language in school education. It created more problems and solved none. Actually, it didn't solve any problem at all. States did whatever they appeared to be politically expedient for them. Popular political expediency was more the criteria. Therefore, what happened? Some taught English and Hindi, some in schools, some taught Tamil and English, some Gujarati, English and Hindi. The situation now is far too different. South rejects Hindi. Hindi belt refuses to learn another South Indian or at least an Indian language. Tribal languages are now beginning to stake their own claim. Bodo, for example, is now a constitutional language. So now functionally, it is two language formula for most people, Hindi belt and South. And it is three language formula for some, like people in Odisha, maybe Bengal, Assam, and some other states. And it is four language formula, four languages for tribal minority children. In Odisha, for example, a tribal child needs to learn the tribal language, the state regional language Odia, and English and Hindi. Therefore, what is the three language formula for? Who is it for? It's actually talked about a bridge for a linguistically united India. This is also implicitly mentioned, explicitly in some places perhaps, in the national education policy. That three languages will become a bridge. It will integrate the linguistically diverse languages, diverse linguistic scenario in India. I think three language formula is a bridge to nowhere. It's like, I think some of you may have heard of the bridge on river Cholteca in Honduras. Honduras weather conditions are really bad. A lot of flooding and all that. Bridges were washed away. In 1998, they decided to build a bridge over river Cholteca with Japanese technology, very modern Japanese technology. The same year in October, they had a bad hurricane situation. It rained for about 75 inches in 4 days. And therefore, what happened as a result, this bridge, all the roads leading to and from the bridge and all the habitat, that was all washed away. And what is most important, the river itself had changed its course because of the flooding and all that. So river now, the bridge now stands on a more wooden rock structure without any river underneath, without any road leading to and from it. It's a fossilized structure. Our three language formula everything has changed. Our ground conditions have changed. The river of languages in India has changed its course. But we continue to bank on the bridge, which is a bridge to nowhere. I think we need to realize that. We need to realize that repetitively talking about three language formula as a slogan would lead us nowhere. We need to talk about ground realities for a child. It doesn't take a child perspective, it takes a perspective top down. We need to view languages from the perspective of a child. I think
all the researchers, a lot of researchers in India clearly show that children constantly employ multilingual registers. They constantly translanguage, depending on the area they live, in the language that interlocutors speak, they translanguage. So, many pedagogic experiments are done around these multilingual registers. So the areas where 4 to 10 languages are spoken in the same classroom, 4 to 10 mother tongue or home language, there are pedagogic innovations done using these multilingual registers. But this particular section, even if the title of it reads as multilingualism, it doesn't talk about multilingual registers anywhere. It only talks about single language at any point of time. And therefore it talks about bilingual, like mother tongue hyphen English textbooks, high quality in mother tongue hyphen English textbooks. So it actually is a very monolingual model at one level. From pedagogy point of view, if I look at classroom pedagogy, it's very monolingual. Okay, suppose we accept that, then I ask the second question. Isn't the phraseology of the RT 2009 and NEP 2020 identical on issues of children's rights to education in their first or the strongest language? They use the same slash, mother tongue slash home language slash regional language slash everything. And then they also use the sentence I'll read out. In RT chapter 5, they mentioned that the children will be taught in their home language or I think in mother tongue till class 2 as far as possible. So they, in an RT document, you don't mention. So if you mention, you know that it is not justiciable. So they use the term as far as possible. And in this document, again, they have done the same thing. Wherever possible, the medium of instruction until at least grade 5, until at least, wherever possible. Look at the phrases. But preferably till grade 8 and beyond will be the home language slash mother tongue slash local language slash regional language. And our experience says that it will never be done or minimally done at the moment. So where do you see the improvement if you look at the language of this document?
Yeah. Well, in course of our about 1 hour discussion by now, we have severally referred to Right to Education Act 2009. But you would be surprised that the National Education Policy of 2020 just makes one reference to 2009 policy, 2009 RT, saying that after the last education policy, a major development happened in RT 2009. That is the only one mention, nothing more. It's just a historical reference without any comment or any discussion on that. There is one second minor reference which says that RTE should be revised from time to time to universalize education and all. That's in a different context. But these are the only two mentions and only one significant one, So that is a surface level apathy. One would, if you read our new education policy and the national education policy and the RTE, there is a apathy. But then the undertones, as you rightly pointed out, the undertones of both the documents are grossly overlapping. No indication of common school system, which was expected. 2009 as well as 2020. And then almost, I think, a hypocritical and apologetic reference to education in mother tongue. RT 2009 actually undid itself in its recommendation of mother tongue education by inserting a convenient caveat in section 29(2)(f) as far as practicable. Yeah, I think that's the language. NEP 2020 is even more evasive. In section 4.9, where it talks about home language, mother tongue, local language as the medium of instruction, at least up to grade 5, preferably up to grade 8 and beyond. There are 3 mentions in one paragraph, 8 lines. In 8 lines, there are 3 mentions of wherever possible. That caveat again is repeated, repeatedly repeated. If RT was ineffective in ensuring education in the mother tongue, national policy is even more tentative, lacking in any direction. National policy is grouping together of mother tongue, local and regional languages makes it convenient again, once again, for the states to continue to use the state majority language as the language of instruction. You see, let us go back to a developmental, psychological, and pedagogic perspective. The question for the child, not for the government or the policy or whatever, or even for us, the question for the child is not the mother tongue or other tongue. It's not the question. It's not an either or binary that as we seem to pose it. Instead of talking about medium of instruction for the child, we should actually be talking about child and her own medium of thinking, because that's what the child carries to the classroom. So we should be talking about medium of thinking for the child as he comes to school. Right to education, I think, must necessarily guarantee right to language, without which crucial access to schooling and education is denied. Even if you go to a linguistic human rights perspective, it's very clear. Child and her community, language community, have a right to use and develop their own language and right to education in child's medium of thinking. That's I think is important for all of us to realize. It is only when education fosters a child's ability to think from a psychological perspective, ability to think for cognitive and academic and literacy engagement, and to think about language, then, and her child's education and her multilingualism, they are all on the right track. We are on the right track. A lot more to elaborate as to why we must do that. But I think let me stop here and then we'll come back to the.
Yeah, we don't have time. So last question.
Multilingual education and all that. Yeah.
We don't have time. So last question, be extremely brief. You can be just enumerative also if you want. Instead of questioning, does the title Multilingualism and the Power of Language maintains the status quo of language hierarchy in school education? As a psycholinguist, do you see any scope for pedagogic diversity and innovation informed by contemporary research on multilingualism in school education?
Well, I think, briefly again, the national education policy continues to reinforce that hierarchy, needless to point out. I think, again, a superficial mention, you should know that Sanskrit and classical languages are mentioned in the document 20 times, whereas an English is referred to 3 times, and tribal language is mentioned only once. Only once, that too only to say that our students need to have a sense for tribal language, so you can see what happens, the hierarchy that is being promoted through how the document is projected. Unfortunately, in multilingual societies, languages are not equally placed. That is the reality. Let us not. I'm not just blaming the new education policy. It has not created the hierarchy. I'm saying it is only reinforcing the hierarchy. In my research and writings, I have always referred to this as a double divide kind of a situation. Say, if you look at the terms of value of a tribal child's own language, besides being a language of her identity, the language itself has no instrumental value. But a language like Assamese would probably have little more value, and language like Hindi would probably have even more. But when it comes to English, there is a great divide between English and other languages, because English has the maximum power. It's the language of higher education, language of economic opportunities, and language of social mobility. So what we are doing actually is we are creating a situation where the tribal languages, the languages of the so-called backward categories and all that, they are completely ignored and pushed down to the bottom. And from a psychological point of view, from a linguistic point of view, this kind of a situation is unfortunate and very wrong, because instead of promoting an egalitarian vision of languages through education, our national education policy actually reinforces that hierarchy. Repeatedly, English comes through, as you rightly pointed out, comes through as the second language, which is the major language after the lip service to the mother tongue. So what happens is English remains as a, I'm not denying the fact that English is a significant language in Indian education, but not at the cost of mother tongue. This is what we need to understand from a psychological, psycholinguistic point of view. The generation of intellectual, political, and economic and social leaders in the post-independent India were primarily educated in their mother tongue and developed strong scholarship in English. If you look at the senior generation, me, or the senior people, the generation of, and the research shows, apart from that practical social reflection, the research actually shows that there is a strong foundation, that a strong foundation in mother tongue is actually a royal road to quality education and high multilingual competence, including competence in English. It has been, I don't need to elaborate on that. Even British Council, which is the world agency to promote English, it has been consistently saying for last, I think, at least 7 years, that the road to teaching good English is to develop a strong foundation in the mother tongue. And so India's linguistic diversity is actually not a problem in teaching English or whatever. It is actually an asset. Promotion of mother tongue and classroom linguistic diversity is necessary to sustain multilingualism, multilingual competence, good education, and good English. That has been, that's what research has shown. We know enough in research and application in India, a lot of experiments with multilingual education, and in the world all over, to be able to claim that the mother tongue based multilingual education for all is perhaps the most significant process of development of strong competence and quality education. It's unfortunate that our policy makers tend to adopt more populist measures at the cost of future of the nation and its education.
Thank you, Professor Mohanty. We'll come back to all three speakers. And I think we'll take questions from the audience now. We had one small thing, critical thinking, because it has been mentioned again and again in the policy document. I'll just spend 2 minutes on that, and then we'll take questions from the audience, and all three speakers will respond. This document talks about diversity, flexibility, and critical thinking very, very frequently. And critical thinking more frequently than critical pedagogy, of course. But I thought we should discuss a little bit what does this mean as a construct. One is as a psychologist. I would say that, when am I psychologically or cognitively ready to engage in a critical thinking, ready to engage in a kind of reflective thinking where I can reflect on why I think the way I think, or what is happening because of certain things. So psychologists generally say that critical thinking is possible only when the children develop abstract concepts and also develop conceptual machineries in any area to deal with or to understand the world. Like mathematics, subject helps children to develop the conceptual machinery of mathematics. If a child has that machinery, the child will also look at, the basic statistics and understand why certain things are happening the way they're happening. But to be able to critically think, the children need the abstract concepts with them. And the school education, one of the major goals of school education is to develop these abstract concepts and help also the children see the links between these abstract concepts and develop a conceptual machinery in different disciplines, like say mathematics, or say science, or social studies, or history. And when that develops, the child will be capable of critically reflecting on things, or will be capable of critically engaging with his or her own thought processes. So what creates a kind of stumbling block in development of critical thinking? One major thing all educationists say is that if the education is poor or poor quality, and if it is not intellectually accessible to children, then the children do not develop abstract concepts. So the language issue that Professor Mohanty talked about, and also the early concepts that Professor Vinita Paul talked about, are roots to this development of abstract concepts for any children. So the classroom instruction is not intellectually accessible to a child, the child will not develop abstract concepts. The child will not learn, will not engage with any subject. That is how the psychologists look at, and if we do not develop a good quality and also intellectually, socially, and socially accessible school education discourse, the children will not develop critical thinking. So talking about critical thinking without ensuring any of this is actually meaningless. So I also don't see how we talk about critical thinking without making early education or primary and other sectors of education linguistically and otherwise accessible to children. And therefore language plays a very major role. And we should also look at the way sociologists talk about, how do we develop criticality? A document which completely erased the social history of domination, say of caste, say gender, say class, say religion, it cannot develop a critical thinking in children. And its pedagogy can never be critical till we allow that. So a document which, almost creates a clean slate on that, erases that social history completely, cannot ensure critical pedagogy. So I think this document, if I look at it from psychological perspective, then if everything is done right in schools and universities, then there is a possibility for the children to develop conceptual machinery, which will allow them to engage in critical thinking. But this document certainly has defeated us on inviting or at least representing the structures of domination and how these structures of domination have deprived significant percentage of children from getting or accessing meaningful education. If that social history is erased, I don't think critical education can be guaranteed to children. And this document, and this had been pointed out in 2018 when the first big draft, the biggest draft, 484-page draft was published. Everybody, including us, talked about it. That yes, we need to talk about caste, we need to talk about patriarchy, we need to talk about class, how they create conditions that lead to children not being able to access good quality education. And so I thought the document, even though drops these concepts too frequently, at least critical thinking too frequently, it doesn't create a discourse that can ensure school education or higher education, which is sufficiently critical. I think now we'll open to questions from the audience. Dr. Tusa, you have the questions from the audience. So please read out, or if you want, the speakers can, whoever has asked the question can ask directly, and there can be dialogue between the person and the speaker also. And please also keep, please be the timekeeper as well. We have 30 minutes, so take questions and be the timekeeper for this 30 minutes. Thank you. Tushar, over to you.
Yeah, so there was one question from Dr. Chandranshu Sinha. I have allowed him in the panel. Chandranshu, sir, are you there? Dr. Chandranshu Sinha.
Yeah, I see his video or something,
Sir, you are promoted as panelist. You can switch on your video.
You can ask his question.
You just unmute your Chandranshu, unmute and then ask the question.
Okay, I think he's facing some problem. I will read his question. Professor Mohanty, sir, it appears to be addressed to you. The question by Professor Dr. Chandranshu Sinha. He writes, the NEP document appears to be ambitious and inclusive on the table. But I agree with Professor Tripathi, a very important point which he touched, that how does one prepare is most important stakeholder, i.e. teachers, especially in higher education, in terms of their quality and values. How does one addresses this issue when majority of higher education has dearth of teachers?
Well, if you look at the document as a whole, go to the higher education section and then go to the management of higher education section. You'll see that it talks about a light but tight system of regulation, and surprisingly, there are dozens of regulatory bodies which are suggested for higher education. There is the Higher Education Grants Council, there will be a General Education Council, there will be a meta accreditation body which will not give direct accreditation, but it will license some other organization which will approve the development plan of higher education institutions and all that. There is absolute, and there is another body which will fix the graduate characteristics. What would be the characteristics for different kinds of degrees and diplomas. There are another system which will talk about the staff and the faculty. So there are a labyrinth of structural organizations in the name of the so-called light but tight regulation, which will make it completely inoperable apart from the financial difficulties that will be created. And therefore, this is a document which I think, as far as teachers are concerned, as far as teaching is concerned, it is unworkable. We know, for example, when I'm focusing more on teacher education because quite a few have questions on teacher education. We know the quality of teacher education is extremely poor. There are NCERT data to show that our trained teachers are worse than untrained ones. Therefore, training has had no effect. Our teacher training institutions are extremely poor. So in face of all these, I think it's a very hypothetical air in the castle, castle in the air, to sort of talk about education and all the changes among the faculty and teaching processes and all that. It will probably never happen because the document has not taken note of the current state of affairs. What has happened from the last policy to date has not been taken into account. There is not a single university in India, university or educational institution, which ranks among the top 100 in the world. But we are talking about taking in Indian education to the top world position will be Vishwa Guru by the year 2035, in 15 years from now. It's an unworkable dream. I think we need to realize, and I have no hope of any substantive changes on the basis of new education policy.
The next question is by Asmita Dwivedi. Asmita Dwivedi, can you unmute and come on video? Asmita Dwivedi, if you are listening.
Okay, you can pose her question. I see she's on mute, but yes. I don't see her video. So who the question is intended to? I think that is more important.
The question, the speaker is not mentioned, but the question is NEP discriminatory in nature? Is it formulated in a way, for example, foreign institutions coming to India, that would mostly facilitate the privileged or upper caste students?
I think Minati should take up this question. You are on the mute. On mute.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I agree with her because see, it's again the capability. Like who can access the foreign education, okay? And these universities will come for profit. They will charge us much more even than the Indian private universities charge us. So only the rich can join. And even if they have a social policy geared towards poor students, but still the rich will benefit most. So the economic gap only will increase. But I want to ask you one thing. I mean, fine, if you can allow some foreign universities to come and open their shops, but where is the scheme to make Indian universities and also the Indian the governmentally funded, publicly funded, universities to improve its quality? If we do a good job there and we allow some foreign universities to come in, it's okay. But if you give a blanket permission to 100 top foreign universities to enter this country, we will only strengthen the structures of inequality much more. And it will also lead to privatization hugely. And therefore, I'm definitely warranted against it.
The next question is for Professor R.C. Tripathi, sir. Sir, are you there? Tripathi, sir?
Well, I think you can ask the
Yes.
question and we'll see anyone, Professor Tripathi or somebody else.
In many
Yeah,
states,
Professor Tripathi is now there.
yeah, sir is there. So this is the question by K.S. Misra. In many states, students with less than 20% cutoff score get admitted to college and they appear only at the time of examination. How their learning styles can be assessed in order to adopt teaching style to influence their attainments.
Well, as of now, there is no provision that it can be done. I don't think that the teachers really know anything about educational styles to begin with. So I think they will need to be trained. Um, what I think is required by new education policy is that there should be teacher training, extensive teacher training. Unless they change, I don't think there is there's any hope for this society, this policy translating on the ground.
He has again a question for Professor Mohanty, sir. Can we make children understand to write in different languages as envisioned in this policy?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Can we make children understand to write in different languages as envisaged in this policy?
Well, actually, if you use a true multilingual pedagogy and use linguistic classroom as well as social linguistic diversity as a resource in the classroom, it should be possible for a child. Writing is a very specific skill. I'm talking about more general expressive skill, both speaking as well as writing. It should be possible for a child to write in many languages and to express herself in many languages, provided the thinking medium of the child, which perhaps roughly corresponds to mother tongue but not identical to it, if that is used in the initial years of teaching, so that competence in the mother tongue is fostered to a level where the child is able to think critically in her own language, whatever that is, language or languages. So, and also to reflect on languages, because in order to go from one or two languages to many, the child has to be able to reflect on different languages. We all do that when we are learning a new language. We reflect on the new language on the basis of what we know of our own language and so on. So once the child is able to reflect on that, for example, when a child is reading, the child understands what is the story structure. That story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and so on. So that understanding will transfer from mother tongue to the other languages. I don't need to go into the details of the multilingual education pedagogy, but if you are using the right kind of pedagogy in teaching languages, it should be possible for a child to express herself, read and write in multiple languages, including in English. Thank you.
Can I join you for this question? Our own education has already shown we have enough data. Like each one of us can write in 2-3 scripts. Okay, I think it's at least 2 scripts. Any Indian can, whoever is literate in a formal space, can write. I think the major question is that reading. Are we efficient reader in 1 or 2 scripts or more than 2 scripts? And do we read with comprehension? And then do we then use this for even more complex academic works? It is possible. And we have done it. I mean, all of us can read and write in 2 to 3 languages and sometimes in 2 scripts. Okay? But what we need is probably to focus on is that what we need to enhance reading with meaning and criticality in any language using at least one script, and subsequently in multiple languages using more than one script. And it's possible.
Next question is from Anamika Rai. My question is related to teaching learning aspects in higher education. How teaching learning quality can be taken care without considering learners' learnability approach, especially in the current changing phase with lot of technological advancements and less of place teaching.
I think Professor Tripathi or Benita can take care of this.
Professor Tripathi or Vinita, one of you can take care.
Vinita teaches, I think she's in from NCRT, so she should take it up.
I'm sorry, my mind was somewhere else. Can the question be repeated?
Yes, sure, ma'am. My question is related to teaching learning aspects in higher education. How teaching learning quality can be taken care without considering learners' learnability approach, especially in the current changing phase with a lot of technological advancements and less of place teaching.
Less of, sorry? Less
Place
of?
teaching, place teaching. Yeah. Physical teaching environments you mean to say.
Online teaching.
Yeah.
Well, I know
online versus physical, more online, less physical.
Yes. I think that it also depends upon the nature, the content that is being, or the method, the how should I say, the pedagogical aspect of it that is being actually incorporated into the online teaching. Because what happens in a classroom teaching and a face-to-face teaching is that also the teacher is has some kind of a understanding of what the context is and plays to that context, to the best of my understanding, in terms of the social level, the language spoken, to make it more customized to the composition of the classroom. And that is the advantage in a physical setting as opposed to the online. But in the online, what I feel is that it is what is very important, how to do, the question is how to do it. I think it is very important to understand how the online should not be a replication of the physical, the methodology used in physical spaces. It has to have, it has its own specific kind of a pedagogy, as I have understood, which means that it is more directed towards individual learning, so that it becomes much more much more individual, because it becomes more responsive rather than how should I say it? It becomes much more, it elicits much more of the person's own experience into the kind of interaction that is happening, rather than just communicating a particular worldview or a particular perspective. So it's a two-way traffic which needs to be there in an online situation. So the materials, the learning resources, the interactions that are whatever possible within an online space have to be accordingly modified and adapted. I think that is very important. So what is happening today in many cases is that the syllabus is being replicated through the online mode, which I think is very, very worrisome, because that is not the way to do it. Not that I'm an expert in online, but this is just my own understanding of it.
Yeah, I think I should take it as a last question. It is by Dr. Swati Patra to Professor Mohanty. She writes, when NEP talks of mother tongue as medium of instruction in the early years, how to implement in metropolitan cities where people from various mother tongue languages are there? What is the implication of teachers' training?
See, mother tongue is not a binary category. Mother tongue is a continuum. Now, let us assume not just in metro cities, but also in tribal areas. You have classroom with 3 to 5 languages. Now, we have demonstrated through small experiments. I have not had the opportunity and resources to engage in a large scale experiment on that. But in a smaller scale, we have demonstrated a number of times that it should be possible in a classroom with adequate and reflective teaching practices. Allow the child, the teacher, some freedom to experiment. It is possible for a teacher to develop each child's mother tongue and at the same time develop a strong multilingual awareness. This kind of education is being tried in Paris, for example, in other European cities, in Canada, in Toronto. I have visited few schools which would engage in that kind of practice, promoting taking a diverse group of children, Chinese, Urdu speakers, Punjabi speakers, Hindi speakers, and so on, Bengali speakers, and then trying to develop each child's mother tongue and a strong mother tongue identity, and at the same time develop English. So it should be possible. I think it should be possible, except that we need to allow the teacher the freedom to experiment with that. Unfortunately, what happens, our teachers don't have freedom. They are given a top-down process of teaching and all that, whatever they have to teach, and that doesn't allow them. It's possible. It's very much doable that given the multilingual diversity and multilingual exposure of children and their propensity to learn multiple languages, it should be possible to fruitfully engage in a classroom transaction which promotes mother tongue of each child, at the same time promotes children, because children, when let us assume you have a group of children who belong to different language groups, do they not communicate with each other? Maybe not in the class, but the moment they go out in the playground, they do communicate. So language has never been a barrier to communication for children. It's only for us who think of language as categories, and therefore we think, how can a Tamil child speak to a Rajasthani child or Bhojpuri child? No. The question is, children develop their way of communicating, and if we follow that that is what we have done in our studies. If you follow that instruction method, and then method has been tried and developed in other countries as well, then it should be possible to engage in a multilingual, a fruitful, effective multilingual education for children using the diversity in the classroom as a resource. It's not a problem. Thank you.
In fact, one correction we need to make. Of course, this language part is so badly written, the multilingualism part. I don't know what to return and what to remove. But one major correction we need is that when we say mother tongue, also use S in that, mother tongues or regional languages.
Yeah,
because
I
most classrooms have,
Yeah.
What is the philosophy behind such a claim? Is that children's strongest languages are used in the classroom to first establish communication, use them as mediational resources to teach, and gradually everybody together will move towards one or two acceptable languages which will become the medium of instructions in future. But one has to start with many mother tongues. But every time we talk on mother tongue education, it is one language. No, that's not the reality of this country. That's one. Second, also I want to talk about, we have another scholar, Ramakant Agnihotri, who's a linguist, who talks about every language, is a multilingual resource. That's one point he makes. But the second major thing, which all of our mind, Professor Mohanty's, Agnihotri's research clearly show, that in our daily, everyday world, we constantly translate this. When we say I'm speaking in Odia, I bring a lot of English or Hindi, depending on where I am, when I talk. So we use many multilingual registers. So what we should be talking about, even when we use a right perspective, and we want to give the advantage to the children of minority communities or linguistically minoritized or minority communities, we still need to use mother tongues based multilingual education for India. There cannot be a mother tongue based
Yeah,
multilingual
I think
education.
that's why, I said it's without engaging into the definition of mother tongue or mother tongues, we need to realize only two things. One is child has a language identity and child has a medium of thinking. It may be multiple language based medium of thinking. And as long as we are conscious of those resources that the child brings to the classroom, it should be possible to have a child in the school education, through school education, develop a child who has a high multilingual competence.
One last thing I want to say, because both of us work on language, that this requires a very different kind of pedagogic imagination, where we need to talk about diverse pedagogic practices.
Yeah.
So the pedagogic heterogeneity is a must. Second, this at the part 10, 1 minute. This is a 4.14, which talks about high quality textbooks, but in mother tongue -English, that actually finishes the paradigm that we are talking about. That's not multilingual paradigm. That's not a paradigm meant for a diverse, heterogeneous country like ours, where every one of us is plurilingual, and we always constantly employ multilingual registers to communicate daily. And why the schools survive, and why some children in linguistically remote areas, in remote areas where the children's languages are not same, or at least are very different from school language, how the children survive and do well, because the teachers allow children to still communicate in their languages. Teacher is still sensitive to multilingual registers, and teacher still doesn't police the playground or the corridor, or when children talk to each other inside the classroom. That is how our education has survived. If school education has survived in rural areas, in tribal areas, it is because the teachers have smuggled, on their own multilingual pedagogy to classroom. So I don't think this country has an alternative to multilingual pedagogy. And this NEP 2020 doesn't at all talk about that paradigm. It says something, uses that term, but that paradigm is completely lacking in this document. Okay, I think I'll over to you, sir.
There are many questions, but we are almost at the end of time. So should I take some more questions, or let them? I can always email all these questions to you if some of these could be answered personally to those who have sent these questions. Or would you like to take up one or two more questions?
No, I think we should stop now.
You can conclude. Before you thank others, I must thank you for actually organizing these webinars from now. And since we have a policy division, social policy division, we thought we should discuss national policy of education in this series. And we should also bring in more policies for discussion in future as we have time, whenever we have time. You
yes.
can thank others.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity to organize, but it was actually your initiative to organize a webinar on this topic. On the behalf of the NAUP community, on the behalf of psychologists in India, on the behalf of all the participants who are listening to this vibrant discussion here on Zoom platform, as well as on the live streaming on Facebook, as well as on YouTube, I extend my heartfelt thanks to all of you, Tripathi sir, Mohanty sir, Minati Panda ma'am, Vanita ma'am, for being here and enlightening us on the very important aspects of new education policy, especially from the point of view of psychologists. Since the day this has been passed by the cabinet, there has been debates on social media and all sorts of, even we have seen many newspaper editorial on the issue, but there were hardly any discussion on the psychological aspects of this policy. And for that reason, it was a very important discussion that now tried to held. Lately, I have seen that after we have organized, advertised this workshop, there are few more webinars that are lined up on the issue. So at least we are happy, or we can be happy, that discussion on this aspect of this policy has started. I also thank all the participants who was there, who are there with us on several platforms. This webinar is being telecasted. All those who registered for this webinar, it attracted a huge audience, and we had more than 500 registrations for this. We had 100 participants all the time here, and about the same number there on our Facebook live streaming. I would also like to thank all NAOP officers who have been behind this initiative by now, but they have entrusted me for this responsibility of organizing these series. We are trying our best from the NAOP platform to encourage and organize debates on various issues. The next debate on NAOP is with collaboration of Center of Advanced Study, MS University, Baroda, and it will be hosted by NAOP Developmental Psychology Division. And the title of this webinar is Parenting in a Digital Era. It will be organized on September 1st, 2020 between 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. We'll soon be circulating the advertisement for the same for NAOP members and for general public. I request you all to join this as well. And in September, in September, we'll have many more webinar sessions on various issues of psychological concern. I once again thank you all the panelists for being here. Your presence is always encouraging us, the young buddies in India, trying to learn a lot from you people, and your presence always make us, encourage us to do good in this. With all these, I would like to seek your permission to end this session and wish you all best of luck.
Okay, thank you, Tushar. Thank you.
Thank you, Tushar.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Bye, Professor Mohanty, Professor Tripathi, Tushar.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you all. I will
Thanks,
now end
Arvind.
this session, and this recording of this webinar will be available on NAOP YouTube channel soon after we end this session. Thank you all once again.
Thank you.